Hey, welcome to day 78 AP Bio. Today we're going to take a look more into, of course, the internal organs of a pig, which would usually be our thing with a fetal pig dissection, and a bigger look into, how our choices affect the rest of the world. So let's take a look at this guy. This is a beautiful ocean wanderer. This is Lason's albatross, and this albatross, like many albatross, it spends, 95% of its life out at sea. It feeds in the sea. It doesn't even need to drink fresh water. It gets all of that from its food. It's got these amazing glands in its nose to get rid of the salt content that's in there. And it can do that. But, of course, one thing that does have to come to land for, being that it lays eggs, is reproduction, right? And this is a picture of a licensed albatross chick. And they're kind of goofy looking. They kind of look mammalian with all that downy fuzz, right? Little fluff balls. And man, he's fat. That kind of goes back to my question of why is this little chubby fella so fat? And that's where you come in. You've got some biological knowledge by now. You should be able to tell me why this albatross chick is so fat and fuzzy and cute, kind of, right? Sweet. Pause me. Try to figure it out, right? Now, one of the things that we should notice, we tackled this together, is a lot of kids have thrown out ideas in the past of, well, he's so fat and fuzzy because, well, his parents have to feed out at sea, and they can be gone for a couple days, maybe even a week if conditions aren't very good, and then they have to make their way back because the parent can cover hundreds of miles in a day searching for food. It's a surface feeder. It feeds on things like shrimp, krill, squid if it can get a hold on it, or fish if it's lucky, right? And that flies all the way back and it feeds this chick. So for the chick, it gets a nice rich diet of this fatty stuff, which can add on the pounds, which is great because the chick has to sit on the nest and wait for the parent to come back. If it was skinny, it wouldn't survive. And then other people are like, well, it's an albatross. It can't fly that well. So it has to, of course, nest on beaches where it gets a lot of the onshore wind so it can take off. It's hard for it to take off without the wind in its favor, so it can soar up into the wind and get more lift. So that means that it's on a windy beach, so a chick that's stuck on that beach has got to have fat and all that fuzz, right, insulation, to stay warm because it's a warm-blooded creature. It's got a highly efficient system, but it burns calories like crazy. So maybe that's why it's so fat and fuzzy and adorably cute. It kind of looks like the fawns, right, and they're fuzzy. And well, yeah, that all makes sense. But this chick is fat, but he's especially fat. And why is he so fat? Well, it's because he's dead. He's bloated. He's completely full of this wonderful stuff called plastics. Now, sadly, when scientists went to the island, this guy lives on Midway Island, they found tons of chicks that were dead on the nest, and when they opened them up, or they were already opened by, other birds feeding on them, or rats, what they found was there are just chock full of plastic. And one of the reasons why he's so fat is because he had so much plastic that he couldn't digest in his body that it just sat there, and he starved to death. That's why he died. Couldn't absorb enough nutrients. And the interesting thing is, if you look at this collection of plastics, you see some interesting patterns. There's some serious medical waste like syringes. There's fishing tackle and stuff. But most of it, if you look at most of it, you should recognize it. Most of it's plastic bottle caps from single-use disposable plastic bottles. So, what's going on with this guy? Is he like picking along the beach and picking up plastic bottle caps and eating them because he's not a very smart chick and like they look like food and they're bright and shiny like most kids? Ooh, look at that. Is he eating those? Is he picking them up? Is it just because the chick is not very intelligent? No, he lives in one of those isolated places on Earth. There aren't humans on his island, really. So what's going on here, of course, is all these single-use plastic. You can see cigarette lighters are a big part of that, bread clips, but especially bottle caps. Bottle caps are the biggest one. Those ones that you take off and you throw in the trash, and then if you're responsible, you throw the plastic bottle in the recycling side. But they have trouble recycling these, so they just go in the trash, right? And they last forever. Whoa, thousands of years. Those, of course, float out at sea, and the way that they get them is their parents give them to them, which seems kind of like, wow, that's really dumb. But it's because the parents have evolved for millions of years to feed on the surface, and what they feed on, of course, are the things that are floating at the surface, like colorful reddish shrimp and squat lobsters and things like jellyfish with some red colors or blue colors in them. And, well, fishing tackle, and especially those colorful bottle caps, really show up and float on the surface. And if you've evolved to feed on something that there hasn't been humans there for millions and millions of years, it kind of makes sense that if there's not a lot to feed on the ocean, this giant ocean desert, you're going to take whatever comes along and you're going to carry it back to your chick like a good parent. And for most of their evolutionary history, that has been hugely beneficial and has brought tons of food to their babies and allowed them to succeed far longer than we've been around. And so they continue with that habit. And they feed everything, the good and the bad stuff, to their chicks. And yeah, they get squid and stuff because they're good parents, but they also, unfortunately, have gotten far more plastics. If we look at the research since 1967, they noticed that 74% of the chicks that were on Midway Island had plastic in their guts. Now in 1995, well, it's past now, it was 97.9%. So we can guess by the year, 2020, it's like 100% of them. It's almost like there's a lot of plastic out there or something. I wonder where it's coming from. Now, the scariest part of this to me is that they live on Midway Atoll, and Midway Atoll, as its name suggests, is midway across the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's one of the most isolated pieces of land on Earth, and it's surrounded by this huge, beautiful ocean where there's no people. I think double the distance from Hawaii, right? And this is its beach. And you can see there's tons of plastic fishing tackle. There's flip-flops. You can see those worldwide. And there's plastic bottles, right? Single-use plastic bottles. And if humans don't live there, they had to get there somehow, right? Well, that's the trick of the world. The world, of course, is completely connected by these wonderful things called currents. Some are in the air. Some are in the land itself, right? And then others are in this giant thing called the ocean. And these giant currents ferry water around the Earth with temperature gradients and salinity gradients. They basically make all life on Earth possible. They determine the climate on the planet and all that stuff. They also determine where there's rich food, like off South America or off the North and Pacific coast, right? The Northwest here. And where they live is right here. It's around Midway Island, and they're stuck in what's called the North Pacific Gyre. And this is a giant spinning circulation of water that brings down cold water from up here near the Bering Sea, down past us. That's why our water is so cold in Washington. Down to California, help the kelp forest, right? And then back out along the equator, where it then spins past and warms up. And as it does that, it keeps places like Japan warmer than it would be, just like, in the North Atlantic current that keeps Europe from freezing too much. And if we look at this current, it creates this lovely cycle of, hot and cold, salty and fresh. But since the, development of plastics in the last, 50 years, it's really taken off. It's an amazing invention, but the problem is when we get those plastics, these currents in the water is attached to this thing called land, and there's, close to 8 billion people on this land right now. And one thing that they found is very convenient in the short term is plastics. And so almost everything that we now consume, think of your food items wrapped in plastic, think of the plastic bag that you brought home from the grocery store, all those things got to go somewhere. And we in the Western world, we don't like filth. So we pay a lot of money for garbage collection. And that garbage collection meant that, our garbage and our recycle, because we're so responsible, would go to this lovely place called the landfill, also known as a dump. And when it gets to the dump, we'll notice that with, 470 million people, or how many we have now, it filled up to the point where they run out of landfill space, and taxes in the U.S. are expensive. So they started actually selling our plastic garbage that wouldn't break down to places like China and places like Indonesia and Malaysia, especially now, since China has now said they won't take it anymore because they figured out it was unhealthy for them. They didn't want to be the garbage collectors of the world. And Malaysia needs the money right now, so they're still taking it. But what most of those, of course, will do is they'll stick them on ships, and midway in journey, they just dump them over the side because nobody regulates the ocean, right? In addition to that, every time it rains, any of those plastic bottle caps that you see on the side of the road or that dumped out of the garbage cans when the giant machine was sticking in the garbage truck, my kids love that, those get covered by the water, and the water also flows over the dumps and carries it into our water bodies, like our rivers. And those rivers then carry that out to the ocean, so that all the garbage off North America, Asia, South America, etc., all the way from Europe, right? It all ends up inside the ocean, and it gets stuck in these gyres, which collect it up, kind of like a big toilet bowl, so to speak, but with no flush. And to give you an idea of the size of it, there's one in between LA and Hawaii that is the size, literally, of Texas. And you go out there in this open ocean where there should be nothing but blue, and what you see is a giant floating raft of plastic garbage. And that plastic garbage, of course, is, if you look at it, it's mostly single-use plastic bottles, as well as medical waste, right? And the crazy thing about that, and the National Geographic did a great article last year on Planet or Plastic, the old iceberg theme with, just the tip of the iceberg. And this is part of that garbage patch that's out there where no people live. And when they traveled through it, they were shocked to find this giant Texas-sized patch. Not only did they find the plastic out there, but in the open ocean, anytime that there's anything that gives structure and a possibility of protection, well, you find wildlife. And one that's out there hiding from things like sharks and predatory fish would be things like young turtles. You ever seen Finding Nemo? Hey, dude, we're riding the current, the South Australia current. Surf's up, dude. Well, these beautiful green sea turtles, as well as all the others, loggerheads and stuff, well, they're out there in the ocean, and they're surrounded by the plastic. And with a sea turtle, of course, out of the ocean, one of the things that they feed on is jellyfish. And if you've evolved for millions of years to eat soft-body things that look like jellyfish, you don't have to be smart enough to tell the difference between a plastic bag and a jellyfish. So you just munch on it because you might not run into food. And unfortunately, when they find these turtles dead, and they cut them open, their entire stomach is full of plastic bags. Or the plastic bag's been sucked into their lungs, and now they've aspirated them and they've suffocated, right? Scarier than that is when they cut open the turtles, they also find that the turtles are loaded with tons of tumors. And it looks like the tumors are, connected to these wonderful things called phthalates that are inside of the plastic itself, which, besides eating their eggs and turning their beaches that they reproduce on into, resorts, we also are now eliminating them in the ocean. These turtles that have been around since the time of the dinosaurs and before, right? Now, that's especially scary when we consider that the average shopping bag, right, the plastic bag, the one that's wrapped around this poor crane in Europe, can't fly, he's going to starve to death, right? It's used on average for 15 minutes, and then it's thrown away, especially in this lovely time of coronavirus where everyone is, not using their reusable bags, especially, but they did that the whole time anyways. It's kind of scary to think that something that you use for 15 minutes will now be on the earth on average of several hundred to possibly millions of years, depending on what material it's made of. Could be the styrofoam on your meat packing, could be the plastic that's, in your little plastic bag. And how many turtles or, sharks that feed on those turtles are now going to end up with the plastic and die because the plastic won't break down. We got very good at making materials that wouldn't break down, and now they're stuck in our environment and they're releasing toxins. Good idea, right? Oh, they're so convenient. That's why I never use these plastic bags. I use these lovely things called reusable bags. And you can reuse it and reuse it and reuse it. And it's not 15 minutes. It can add up to, hours and hours and hours of your life, and you don't have to add anything more to the dumps, right? Save a turtle. Don't use a plastic bag. Paper or plastic? Neither. Reusable, right? It's not that hard. Costs a little extra money in the beginning, but, if you keep using it, it's worth it. Saves you money. Now, other things that's even scarier than that is this idea that we have now entered what's called the Anthropocene. And it's the idea that it's the human age, the epoch where humans have changed the environment so much that now we are a major geologic force. And you can see evidence of that if you go to any of the beaches. Like when you go out to the beaches on our Pacific Northwest coast, they're so beautiful. And then you look around, and if you notice, especially after storms, when it stirs up the sediment, you'll see there's an entire layer of plastic. And they're these little plastic pieces because the UV radiation and the power of the sun and all the churning waves break it up into smaller bits, and then, it sinks. No, not really. It floats around. And as it floats, it breaks into things that are microscopic called microplastics. And they did an interesting study off Hawaii recently where they collected a bunch of, the sea creatures that were out there. They want to know how many of these microplastics were showing up. And that's what these green dots are. They're in the food chain. And we talked about biomagnification. If it collects in those things like the zooplankton, it's going to be fed to the fish. And now it looks like embryonic fish, which is where most fish get their lives for coral reefs and tuna. They go out to the sea and they hide out in the sea and they feed on whatever's out there. And unfortunately, what they find out there is our plastic garbage. They are loaded with things called phthalates. And phthalates give a nice flexibility to our strong plastics, which makes them durable and flexible. That's why they're so attractive. And unfortunately, the phthalates don't break down because we invented them. They're not a natural chemical, so that they'd have stable bonds, like PCBs, dioxins, things like that. And as they get into the food chain as these microplastics, they're passed up. But unfortunately, phthalates are an endocrine disruptor. They mimic estrogen. And that means that might explain why a lot of fish are having trouble, making eggs and having babies, and why fish stocks, besides their overfishing, are plummeting. Kind of makes sense when you think about the fact that you're basically giving them a form of the contraceptive pill. Hey, that's like less food for the almost 8 billion people we have. That could be a problem, right? Now, this, of course, you can see that we try in the West to be so responsible that we pay money to hide away our plastics. But in the rest of the world that we call the third world, or the developing world, right, by our standard, this is what a river looks like in the Philippines or Thailand. I've had the liberty, or at least the ability to travel the world. And in traveling the world, one of the things that I've found out is that plastic is truly everywhere. They don't hide it when you're done with your single-use plastic shampoo container, because that's what they can afford because they're poor. They throw it in the street, and then the street gets rained on. It carries into the rivers. This is literally a river. It's a river of plastic, and it pours out, and the benefit of it is it pours out to the ocean. Now, you might be like, hey, that's really stupid and evil of them, but you have to remember that they didn't really experience plastics except for the last 2 generations. Prior to that, in those parts of the world like Southeast Asia, primarily what they used was banana leaves to wrap up their food. And when they were done with their food or whatever process they were using that packaging for, they would cast it in the ground or the river, and it would get flood out to sea, and then it would break down. It disappeared. So it's all about, of course, understanding that this plastic is not the same material. Also, the reason why they're using these single-use plastics is so convenient, like it is for us. And they're now seeing their parents doing it, so it's their norm. Like recycling has become the Western norm. So it's not that they're making an unintelligent choice. It's a matter of ignorance. They don't know yet. They don't have the liberty of our Western school systems to be educated on these things. And most of the people in the West don't even know what plastic bags, where they end up, or what's inside them either. They just use them because they're convenient, because their parents did, right? So if we look at this, we can't really blame them. They don't know yet. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing this. This is why I teach, so that people can understand and treat their world better. And when we look at this, the thing that we notice is if they're young and they're starting to become aware as diseases are showing up in their culture, if they're young, were aware of this, they would look to make the change to reduce those things. They also are hampered by this fact that they're marketed to by Western companies like DuPont, Nestle, with single-use plastics like plastic Q-tips, right? Ear cleaners. You're not supposed to stick in your ears. Why do you need a plastic thing that lasts for thousands of years to clean your ear for under 15 seconds? Why do you need a plastic bag that you're going to throw away when you could just use something made out of cotton and reuse it? Why would you have laws that allow you to cast aside, or at least lack of regulation, all the plastic gear to overfish the ocean and not actually clean it up so that, turtles get to drown and stuff? It's basically because of ignorance. Or if it's not ignorance, it's just evil, right? So if we look at this, we should recognize that this is what it looks like. It's exposed in the third world, but in the first world, we're doing all this stuff. It's just hidden from our view by our little towers of money. So I would hope that people will recognize there are different ways to do this, such as, I've railed on the single-use plastic bottle. I try to not use single-use plastic as much as possible. This is my water bottle. You've seen it in my classroom, and it says Smart Water on it and stuff like that. I didn't buy this bottle. This bottle is a secondhand bottle. I don't buy plastic bottles. This is from my wife, right? And of course, she's really good about not using single use anymore because this is from a couple years ago. And guess what? You can clean it out and reuse it, and it's durable, right? Or some of you have those metal ones. Think about the mines those come from, but you're reusing it. That's the beauty of it. Or when you pack up your lunch, right? You can have these things called Tupperware. Instead of a plastic baggie, you could reuse this and reuse this. And that way, of course, not only does it not make the plastic garbage that can go off and, choke a turtle, right? Save a turtle. But the cool thing about it is I can use this multiple times, and it only had to be produced once. Remember that this is plastic. Plastic comes from oil. Why do we have wars in the Middle East? So we can access oil because companies like DuPont, BP, those companies, of course, are generating huge amounts of plastic because we buy them, right? And then they've done some amazing chemistry to make them durable, but we're just finding out what they do to our endocrine system. So, fish aren't the only ones having reproductive issues right now. It's humans too, right? That can work out. Then we can see, of course, let's say that you do use single-use plastics. My wife probably hates that I do this, but I if we use a baggie, I don't buy them, but somebody does. I reuse and wash them, and guess what? You can use them several times. You don't have to throw them out every time. It's amazing what soap and water can do in a little bit of effort. That's from my mom. Thank you, Mom, for that awesome idea. If we look at this, if you do have single-use plastics like for yogurt containers, I reused mine, and we can see right here that, I planted a tree. I made it my secondary thing to keep moisture in the soil of my new vine maple that I'm trying to grow. So you can reduce and reuse. Because one of the unfortunate things, of course, is in our story of recycling, which makes us feel better, is most of recycling, unfortunately, is a true lie. Most of the materials that you have, if they're not a 2 or a 4, they don't actually get recycled in the United States. They get shipped off to places like China in the past and now Malaysia, where they, of course, become the trash that goes in the ocean because they can't actually recycle them. It's too expensive to do that. In addition to that, recycling plastics actually takes just as much energy as it does to produce them newly. So it's just as how much CO2 and emissions that come out of doing that, plus the oil you got to have a fight in places like the Middle East or conflict zones like Niger and stuff like that. So all those things are tied together. So I'm hoping that with that information, you take a step towards greatly reducing your single-use plastics and thinking about every time you do that, where it ends up. Because it's usually hidden from us, but it's not hidden from you if you, of course, have knowledge. So you no longer have the excuse of ignorance anymore. So if you continue to choose to use single-use plastics and dispose of them freely, then that's not ignorance, that's something else. Oh, stupidity, right? All right, cool. Now, if we look at this, what we normally be going in today, awesome picture, is the dissection of your pig, and we go into the pig organs because we're going to, reduce and reuse our pigs because they were part of bacon production. As we go into those pigs, one of the coolest things that you'd see is they have this umbilical cord, and that umbilical cord figures into your twin that you never, of course, met. That was the one called your placenta. It's this amazing extra organ that you grow at the start of your life that has blood capillaries that actually tie in and flow in an counter current exchange with your mom. You don't actually have direct blood contact with your mom. Her blood flows by yours and you flow yours by hers, and by going in opposite directions, they can increase the rate of diffusion and you can steal all that good stuff from us. As you're born, of course, there's always the second birth, the afterbirth, which is the birth of your placenta, and then that has to be cut away. If you've ever seen a placenta, they're super firm because they're loaded with blood capillaries, all these blood vessels and stuff. It's an amazing organ that keeps you alive. It was quite creepy, and one of the things that we find out that it does have is a lot of antibodies, and it also has immune cell function in it. So there's been some popularity with people eating those. I did not try that, but in nature, that's exactly what the mothers typically would do in things like wildebeest and most mammal species is they eat the placenta because it's really good for immune function and protein loaded, right? Plus, not to attract predators. As we go into the pig's organs today, we'll be looking at specifically what the organs look on the inside. By dissecting them and seeing the major blood vessels and arteries, which have been filled with a a plastic filler, which is why we're going to take our time using this. And you can see things like the wonderful carotid artery that runs up to the brain just in you, the jugular vein that comes down. You can see things like the vena cava, which comes down, the dorsal aorta. You've got the renal, because renal means kidneys. That's feeding your filter system. And then it continues down. You can have things like the hepatic vein. Hepatic means, of course, liver, because you got to have a lot of transforming of materials inside your liver, your major thing for breaking down toxins and converting things. Then, of course, you'll be able to see things like the wonderful iliac artery and vein, things that will run down to your legs eventually. And you can see the brachial one, you know, the one that motorcyclists can break along with their nerve. That's up here in the arm. It feeds all that blood to your fingers. So it's got many of the same blood vessels as ours. You want to learn those. And then we would take out the lungs. You'll see this wonderful thing called the larynx, the voice box. It has vocal cords just like ours. Typically in class, what I would do is then shoot air through it, and you get to hear it squeal like a pig. You can play it like an instrument, just like you do in real life. The lungs we would inject with air to see how much surface area they do, and then flip them inside out to see all those alveoli. There's the diaphragm, that thing that, you know, when you hiccup is spasming. So if you just burp, it releases the gas that's causing the spasm below it. Always a good trick. You can see the pericardium around the heart. That pericardium, of course, if it becomes infected, you could end up with something like scarlet fever like my grandmother had, and that damages your heart for the rest of your life. So you don't want swelling of that area. And then as we get into the heart itself, you'll be able to see the 4 different chambers, the 2 atria and the 2 ventricles, just like our heart, and the carotid arteries that are what we do our bypass surgery on to create basically highway bypasses around. You can only have so many of those before it gets too clogged up with traffic, right? This is the part that bacon loves to clog. Ironic. And then, of course, as we dig into the kidney, we'd be able to slice it open and then see the actual blood vessels that are in with all those wonderful nephrons and their beautiful exchange down the loop of Henle and the renal pelvis that's right here to get rid of that filtrate and concentrate it, right? And then today, of course, we would start our dig in, although it probably would happen the next day, of looking at the pig's brain. And one of the neat things about the pig's brain is it's very protected, so it's hard to get into. It also has this dura mater, this protective membrane that's around it that creates that blood-brain barrier because you don't want the blood going directly into the brain tissue, right? It's surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid. And then the vessels that would run into that to feed the brain itself that you don't want to pop and have an aneurysm. One of the things that we notice with theirs is they have this huge olfactory bulb because olfaction is smell. That's why piggies have so many receptors and they're so good at finding truffles. Ours is dinky, right? You also be able to see things like the optic chiasma, which is the whole reason why what you see on the left side of your face is actually occurring in the back right side of your brain. Everything's flipped for us, not to mention flipped upside down. So we'd be digging into that normally in an average year, right? But it's not an average year. If we look at this, your homework is still, of course, to create your project. You should have already contacted me. Some of you are slowing down on that. With the topics that you're interested in presenting, it's first come, first serve. You got your 5-minute Screencastify video. If you've never done a Screencastify like I'm doing right now, it's really easy. You can learn about 5 minutes. And then you've got your Google presentation slideshow that answers all the questions on the rubric. That, of course, will be submitted by the 9th so that we can then share them out with each other and learn from each other, which is the ultimate goal of this. If we look at this, of course, the main goal of today was to understand the crime of plastics and single-use plastic. Plastics are an amazing material, and you can use them in a wiser way to not contaminate our environment. Because, I mean, a plastic bag, you can replace that and not kill a bunch of turtles or, you know, a bunch of sea life or a bunch of phthalates that could mess up the reproductive cycles of our food chain, right? I highly suggest that you check out this National Geographic of Planet of Plastic. They should probably still have it on their website. In addition to that, if you have not watched A Plastic Ocean, it's on Netflix, I believe. Not an advertisement, but just telling you, it is very informative and give you ideas of what's going on with the planet. You get some visuals of those things. So one thing I do want you to do is ask yourself, do I need to use disposable water bottles, right? Do I need to use single-use plastics? Can I get rid of the baggie or can I reuse the baggie again and possibly not create a whole bunch of these poor little albatross or other creatures, turtles, yeah, dude, riding the current, that are full of plastics and dying unnecessarily just because of our laziness and ignorance. And if it's not ignorance, it's stupidity, right? So to give you an idea of the power of your voice, my in-laws were using plastic bottles in their home, single-use, until my little boys guilt tripped them to recognize what was going on, and they no longer use them, which is awesome. They started, of course, using filtered water that they could then drink in their glasses, right? So you can make a difference. You have more power with your parents than you know, especially with older generations like grandparents. those baby boomers that, in their time, they didn't recognize this was an issue, but we've had time to, develop intelligence and develop understanding of how our convenient lives are destroying our necessary world, the world that keeps us alive every day. So I hope that you found that not only sad, but informative, and hopefully it will shift your life and perspective. Don't worry, the next video will not be as doom and gloom. It will be a little bit of ray of sunshine, because remember, you got to make sure that your audience for your upcoming Eco Issues project isn't totally depressed. They see light at the end of the tunnel, so they are willing to make that change. And you can make changes easily if you just think about it, right?